Alrighty, hello everyone. Hope everyone had a very meaningful Yom Kippur and a wonderful week. Just want to put out a short Indian over here. Um, interesting, interesting pasuk in this week's parsha. It says in the pasuk in Azinu, it says Ki chelek Hashem amo Yaakov chevel nachalasa. It says the portion of Hashem is His nation, and it says Yaakov is the string, the chevel, the rope of His nachala. So Rashi is bothered. What is the solution of chevel? What is the chevel of a nachala? And we're going to see the Rashi's answer to this question, which we'll proceed to analyze. And the other shadow really is, maybe we'll get an answer to, is what is the taich? What is the general taich of the idea that we are the nachala of Hashem? What does that mean? What does that really mean that we are His chelek? So it says Rashi, like you see over here, Yaakov chevel nachala. So it says V'hu hashlishi ba'avos. Rashi, it says that the Yaakov is the third of the avos. A meshulash. So the difference is shlishi is a numerical matter. In other words, 1, 2, 3. Meshulash is third. It's not a numerical thing. It is the first two plus the third, meaning that he is meshulash. Meshulash is a adjective. It's a description of something being three. And Rashi explains that means b'shalosh zechuyos. Yaakov has three zechuyos. Zechus avi aviv, the zechus of his grandfather, the zechus aviv, the zechuso, and the zechus of his father and his own zechus. Harei gimel. Behold, you have three. Kachevel hazeh, like this string. Shu lasoi begimel gedilim, that the string is made with, the rope is made with three knots. Vehu huvanov hayuloi lenachala. And he and his children, I mean Yaakov and his children, were to Hashem for Nachala. V'lo Yishmael ben Avraham, and not Yishmael the son of Avraham. V'lo Esav ben Yitzchak, and not Esav the son of Yitzchak. So, very, very important points over here. That when Rashi says, he says, Avi Aviv Rashi is going out of his way to call Avram Avinu Avi Aviv of Yaakov, as opposed to saying Schus Avram, Schus Yitzchak, Schuso. And we have to understand why that is. Meaning, why is Rashi referring in this Rashi to Avraham as Avi Aviv of Yaakov, as opposed to saying Schus Avram, Schus Yitzchak, Schuso, meaning Schus of Yaakov? Why did he say the grandfather of Yaakov and the father of Yaakov and his own Schus? Obviously, we know who those people are. Why isn't Rashi using their names? So there's that, and then we still have to understand this Indian. What is pshat? What is pshat that? What is pshat that the? I mean, what is pshat in this taka? That Yaakov is the chevel of the nachala of Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Meaning, what does it really mean? What's this Indian of the chevel, the shalish gedilim, and calling it a rope? I mean, what does all of that signify, and how does it add up to what it is that's being said? I mean, we understand. Okay, so yeah, I mean, Yaakov has schos avos. We understand that. So I mean, but what is this idea that it like adds up in him, and he's the third one, and then he has the schos of all three? I mean, what is that idea exactly? How does that work? And how does that create a chevel? And how is that chevel? That is the chevel that Hashem is. That is the nachal of Hashem. That rope, that string, is the nachal of Hashem. This creation of all three. So I think we spoke about it before, but essentially we can't get into this barichas to have a 31-page essay that people can read on this topic, among other things. But this is covered in that essay that discusses this idea more at length. But essentially, the idea is the following thing: we know that Abraham, and by the way, just to point out, so it's who one of and then Rashi in the end, he says, V'lo Yishmael ben Avraham, v'lo Esav ben Shel Yitzchak. So when it refers to Yishmael and Esav, then it does use the names of the people. Yishmael ben Avraham, and then it uses the name Yitzchak. But initially, when it was talking about Yaakov, it's just Chus Avi. Aviv was Chus Aviv, as opposed to saying Chus Avram and Chus Yitzchak. So just pointing that out. However, the main idea over here is the following. We know that Avraham and Yitzchak represented two separate midas, and we're going to briefly understand them, explain what they are, and we're going to attempt to show how Yaakov is in fact he's not the third Av in terms of a number that he just happens to be the third Av. He's the third Av, meaning that he in fact incorporates and is the Bechir, he's the best of the previous two Avos. And we're going to explain in the following manner. We're going to say that, as we know, the Midah of Avraham Avinu was the Midah of Chesed. And as we've explained in the past, the reality of Chesed is tied to the Midah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu of Rachamim, which is the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. And that is for the very simple reason that what Chesed does is that it looks at the reality of the underlying potential that is contained within a human being, and it claims that the very existence of human being, with all the potential that are included in that, is already enough of a siba for that thing to have kiyum, and for that thing to have relevance and importance. So in Abraham's world, din does not exist, and only chesed exists, and his life mission, and he himself as a person, completely represented and personified this idea to the fullest extent of what he was. And the yesod of that idea is essentially that you look at the potential of the person. That's what matters. What matters is the potential. And we said in the past that the reason why Yod Kei Vav Kei, which is the Shem Ha'etzem, it's the most real name of God that we can possibly relate to, Yod Kei Vav Kei. The reason why that represents Rachman is because, in fact, it reflects the objective reality more closely than Din does. Because what it really means is that it's saying is that God is going to be misnaheg with you in a manner which recognizes the entirety of what you are, which by definition in each person includes potential. So when we characterize based off action, we're in fact being subjective. Because if let's say we have a friend and that friend talks in shul, or he does something that's negative, and we look at that and we say, what a ice varf, what a schlep, what a bad person. He's speaking during davening. He's doing this. He's doing that. Whatever it is. Essentially, what you're doing is you're denying the reality of what he is, and you're pinpointing him and attributing the reality of what he is to the specific action they did at one point in time, which anybody would agree is completely ludicrous. Of course, just because someone did something one time, and we just happen to perceive him and done that one time, that doesn't define what he is. He has much more potential, and he has much more to him than that, and he can overcome that and become the most amazing person, and that potential exists within him, and therefore, objectively, the Yud Kei Vav Kei outlook of Rachamim, i.e. Chesed, upon the Brios is actually the more objective outlook. It's actually the more technically correct and real manner of perceiving reality. And that is Avraham Avinu. Now the problem is that Avraham Avinu obviously took this. He was the one who brought this concept into the world, and therefore, as we spoke about in the past, he had to make it the entirety of what he is, and therefore the result of him, purely him, not Sarah, was Yishmael. And as we know, and very, very simply, if you regard only underlying potential without din, which even though it's the more correct and objective outlook, but if that's how you're misnaheg all the time, then obviously the product of that is not going to be okay, because it has no din and no discipline and no musr. As the Medrash says before, chosech shifta sone beno, which means chosech shifta means if you hold back your rod, you're going to hate your child, meaning you have to discipline your child. And the Medrash says that's referring to Avram and Yitzchak because they both respectively didn't correctly discipline their children. This is the Medrash saying this. I'm not saying this. So it's clear that Yishmael is the product of Avram Avinu, who is Rishma is called a Peri Adam, meaning he's completely just exists on the level of existence, meaning that there is no, he doesn't have contribution and specification of contribution in reality based off discipline and the concentration of din and of solidification of definition. Rather, he's the Peri Adam. He's a wild human being, meaning someone who lacks any sort of definition or specificity of contribution, which is true ad hayom hazeh. Meaning that essentially, because in Yishmael's upbringing, the only thing that mattered was the potential without any structure of discipline. So Memela, that's what you get. You get someone who's completely they just exist on the most basic level of just being human beings, without anything more than that, without any evolving further than that. So that's the basic idea. And then you have Yitzchak, who Yitzchak is the opposite extreme. Yitzchak was Din. Din essentially means that you exist completely within the world and within the realm of Din. And as we spoke about in the past, Din is the reality of the measure of a person's impact upon the world in terms of how he is contributing to the world's evolving towards its goal. That is the definition of Din. Din is a subjective matter because it measures proportional growth to the overall plan for Metzius, and it says how much do you contribute, and that determines your level of tzidkus or rishus at any given time. And we prove that, okay, ayin sham, we had that whole proof. But essentially, din is the exact opposite of chesed, because all it wants is that you essentially are putting on a outward display, which will impact those around you towards developing forward to the goal of the world, which is the relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, etc. And that's how he explained the whole idea with Esav asking his father for Melach, how to do the Meiser, even though Yitzchak was lying, but it didn't matter that he was lying, etc., etc. So we said that whole thing. Now, Yaakov is the concept of emes. And Yaakov, what the concept of emes did, or Tiferes, if you want to get Kabbalistic, Tiferes is really the correct term, but what that really talks to is the idea that Yaakov was able to take these two completely opposite worldviews and mannerisms and basically orientations towards reality, and he was able to incorporate both of them into the reality of what he was to come out with a measure of how to appropriately and how to, in a manner which is sustainable, essentially relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and come into a relationship with him and live in his reality. And as I was thinking about this, there is the basic concept is that you have the balance of the chesed and the din is that, and this is, as we said in the past, this is the basis of all of Yiddishkeit. This concept is the basis of the entirety of Yiddishkeit, which is that what Yiddishkeit's brilliance is that it takes chesed into account, meaning that it gives validity and a room, and it gives the exact portion which is needed for the potential and the human being to express himself, and it takes that into account, while it demands development and proportional development and impact on the world around it, etc., etc., while it demands that. But it demands it in a manner which it evolves so that essentially you take chesed into account, meaning that the Torah says that you should live a good life, live an enjoyable life, have bracha, get married, enjoy, have pleasurable activities, etc., etc. But then it also says that you develop, and you have to do din, you have to do mitzvahs, you have to do, and they're equally as important, which is a whole nother thing, but we're not going to get into that right now, which essentially means that, because the way the development actually works is that a person has the place where he feels normal expressed in what his life is, and then what happens is that the din comes upon that place, and if the din and the Torah's brilliance is that it orchestrates the din and the chiyuvim and the obligations in a manner in which they are they come on to a person in a manner which is just enough that with the balance of the rest of his life, the mitzvah that he does it in a way where it actually changes the inner being of what he is. Because we also take into account chesed, which is the regard for the reality of what a person is, irrelevant of what he does or doesn't do. And then we also took in din, which is that he always has to do. When we put those two together in a perfect balance, what that creates is that a person can actually develop into what he is supposed to be, into a being which is in a relationship with Hashem for real, as opposed to it just being a totally internal thing or a totally external thing. So, I mean, as opposed to other religions, which are either one or the other, meaning they're totally internal, and there is really no outward expression of them, they're only believed, or they're totally external, which is totally bepeh. Now, the way that Yaakov does this, and this is the brilliance, and this is the schus of Yaakov himself, is that Yaakov is what we would call the being who introduced the reality of integrity. And we know this by when it says that the Shvatim, it says that mitoch gnusan atlamed shivchan, they were never echad bepeh ve'echad b'leiv. This was the midah of the Shvatim, as they are the children of Yaakov. As we know that the concept of the Shvatim in Mitasei Shlema is attributed to Yaakov, and essentially what that means is, and I think this is correct, this is a thesis in work and development, which is that I believe that the midah of chesed and the regard for human life only, which is the Avram's midah, that's only belief. Essentially, that exists in the heart, which is internal. It exists internally, and the midah of Yitzchak, which is din, which is external, exists bepeh. In other words, that if someone is all about the internal, he's all about the reality of what the human being is, and that's what he sees as valid, he's working from his heart, meaning he's being poyo, and he's doing for others, and he's all those things. The makor of them is not because he's trying to show someone something. He's not trying to give an impression to somebody else. Rather, he just wants to be genuine. He just wants to express his heart. He just wants to do what he feels is right. That's believe. And then you have bepeh, which is the external version of reality, which is that when you operate bepeh, unfortunately, most people just operate on this. It means that you're yapping, meaning you're talking to people. It's what people can hear from you. So that's the din. That is the reality of what the person, the impression that they make upon others. And Yaakov's ability to unite echad bepeh, echad believe, for those two functions of the human element, the human reality, to become one and congruent, is itself the tseiruf that's needed for the development of a Klal Yisrael. And that was his whole time. I mean, if you're not echad bepeh, echad believe, and if you're always consistent with what you feel and in your heart and what you say, that essentially means that you're never displaying anything that's not what you are, and therefore it gives you the ability to evolve into more and into greater and greater levels into a real relationship, because you're completely honest with yourself and you don't show and you don't speak anything that's not what that is. And so, just to be clear, it is two separate sources of reality. Peh is one source and Leiv is another source. But Echad bepeh, Echad believe, meaning that those two things have to align. A person can't show and express and speak to others in a manner which is incongruent with the underlying reality of what he is, which is exactly the whole idea of the chesed and the din, and that is the whole midah which allows for the integration. By the way, I just realized this as I'm speaking. Integrity and integration are actually the same word. And that's because I think of the idea that we're talking about. That integrity is in integrating the whole of the person. And when you get the whole of the person, and he's integrating both of the parts of what he is, then you get integrity. Um, and so I think that that is really the koyach of Yaakov, the emes of Yaakov, and that itself is the cheva. In other words, the manner in which we can be Hashem's chelik, the manner in which we can be Hashem's chelik is where we are completely inwardly and outwardly committed to the reality of ourselves as being totally what we show, and therefore we're able to be the chelik of Hashem. Because in order to be the chelik of Hashem, the portion of Hashem, that requires two things. It requires the Avram Avinu. In other words, it requires the lave. It requires that we genuinely relate to God and love Him, like Avram, like it says, Avram Ohavi. And then it also requires that since Hashem is a meitiv and He wants the whole world to have what it is that we have, at least to a certain degree, it requires that we're also beped, it requires that we're also in din, and we are also able to show that and be that to other people, so that other people can also learn from us, and we can be in Or La'amim, which is Mefurish in the Psukim, that's our responsibility. And so essentially, the whole gift of the Jewish people is that they are able to really inspire, because as the Gemara says, Davar yotz min halev nichnas halev. If something comes from the heart, if someone speaks from their heart, it goes into another person's heart. And in order for you to speak from your heart, you have to be totally and completely honest with yourself and where you're holding, so that when you do say something, you're not just rattling an idea that you heard from somewhere else, or that, you're actually speaking from your heart, because you're integrated 100%. The chesed and the din are completely one, and therefore when you speak, you can speak from your heart, which is the power of the Jewish people. The power of the Jewish people is they can speak from their heart, thereby impacting those around them, thereby impacting the world, thereby bringing it to its conclusion. And that is why we are the chevel. That is the rope. The rope is the three schosim together: the chesed of Avram, the din of Yitzchak, and the integrity, the emes, the balancing, the sustainability, the congruency between the lave and the mouth of Yaakov. Those three things all together make up the rope, and that rope is the nachal of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's his inheritance. What does that mean? It's his inheritance. It means that it is the place in the world which belongs to him. That's what nachala means. If someone gets a nachala, an inheritance, it means that it belongs to him because it is him, because it was his father's, and he is the son of his father, therefore he gets it. The idea of an inheritance is that it's your right because of the fact that it is you. It belongs to you. It has inherent connection to you based off what you are. And therefore, when we achieve this status of Yaakov Avinu, that is godliness. That status is itself godliness, and therefore we are the nachala of God, meaning God, we are God's portion because we are godly to the extent that we're able to achieve this status of Yaakov. And as we know, we're not going to get into it now, but Mefurish in the Psukim that Yaakov is called Kel, he's called God because he's. We're not gonna get into all that right now. It's a very long sugya, but that is essentially the idea, that it is the chevel. Yaakov is the rope, and that rope is nachala. And it's probably not a coincidence that the idea is that that chevel is itself also the reality uh, of sustainability. In other words, it ties two things together and it keeps them there. That's really what it's meant to do, and that is the taich of Yaakov Avinu.